Welcome to part 2 of this series on hunter-gatherers and human ancestors. In part 1, we spoke about the diets of hunter-gatherers and our prehistoric ancestors. Now, we're going to talk about health of those populations, specifically using lifespan and cause of death as indicators. I'd love to start this video with a very interesting quote that I found while I was looking through papers on diet, health, and lifespan and these kinds of things in relation to how we typically view our human ancestors or the natural human. Life was better in the past is a foundational and reoccurring idea in Western thought. Origin stories from the lost Garden of Eden in Genesis to the golden age of ancient Greece describe a utopian past where humans lived in harmony. Can we be confident that conceptions of past employed in public health are not romanticized caricatures of some lost Eden? In other words, do we actually have a good sense when we're thinking about what life was like before civilization, before modern medicine, before modern housing, before modern understanding of nutrition and diet and so on? Or do we have a romantic view of that, a fantastical view? And I guess watch the video to find out. These are still some of the first videos on this channel. I'll be messing around with formats, with editing. Previously I used a script, this time I'm doing less scripting. So let me know in the comments what works better, what works worse, if you have any feedback. And of course, do the usual and hit all those like, subscribe, reload, send to your friends, share buttons. And hopefully this channel can grow with you and me. As we jump into the discussion of health, it would be good to have some sense or some definition of what constitutes health. And I don't want to go into some elaborate definition right now because to me it's actually quite a complex topic and I don't know that there really is a singular answer that can tell us what health is. But we can look at some common diseases and common aspects of life to get a sense about health of a given population. So for example, from a disease standpoint, we can talk about cardiovascular disease, cancer, diseases of the gastrointestinal system or the digestive system like metabolic disorders or diabetes, obesity, and so on. And we can also look at infectious disease, which tells us about immune systems, their robustness, and how populations interact with the outside world. And lastly, we can also talk about the lifespan and cause of death. How long do populations live and what do they die of? This might tell us just how healthy or something about the health of these populations. Let's start off with a discussion about lifespan of humans over the course of human history. This will tell us a little bit about the natural age that a human might die at and tell us a bit about how we may have extended or shortened human life with modern civilization. Here's a graph of survival curves for various populations throughout human history, dating all the way back to the Paleolithic era. Each point on this graph represents the likelihood of a person at a certain age to die or to survive effectively, depending on which population they were in. This data was collected from skeletons from various burial grounds and other sources of remains. Each curve is obviously an estimate, given that we didn't actually know how old any of these people were that died and turned into fossils. But that being said, various estimation techniques were used by analyzing the skeletons, probably by analyzing the teeth and the crania. For example, the bone density or the translucency or the amount of wear in a tooth can all indicate age. What we see from this is that actually the older civilizations had a pretty consistent chance of survival at different ages and typically wouldn't survive past the age of 75 too often. As you go to the 2000 CE, which is effectively 2000 AD, time periods or populations, you actually find a much higher likelihood of survival at all ages, and the highest actually for the UK population. This may surprise some people, especially if they thought that natural or ancestral life actually did grant a higher likelihood of survival at old age. And specifically, there's a discussion or argument about the fact that all of the numbers about survival or lifespan of older populations is actually brought down because of infant mortality, which is correct if you include all of the children that didn't actually survive past the youngest ages. They will bring down the averages, but the beauty of all of these curves in this survival graph is that they separately account for ages beyond the infant. So you can actually see per age group what the likelihood is of survival. And even with that taken into account, you see that modern civilization keeps people alive at all ages at a much higher frequency. Well, you might also say, hey, I get that this is science, but as we said, we're talking about estimates here, and how good are these estimates? And we could actually dig into that and try to figure out what the efficacy is or accuracy is of dating some of these older remains. But instead, we can also look at some existing populations where we can actually find out true ages of death. So let's move on to some of the modern hunter-gatherer lifespans and the data around that. What we can see is that the hunter-gatherer curve peaks between 65 and 75 years old, meaning the most common age for a hunter-gatherer to die is between 65 and 75 years old, given those populations that were listed. Whereas in the United States, the peak is around 85. And overall, you can see again, there are many fewer deaths that even lead up to the peak age of death. Whereas in the hunter-gatherer tribe, you still have a pretty high likelihood of mortality all the way up to the modal age of death. Of course, these numbers vary across the tribes within the hunter-gatherer group. So if we look in the top left panel of this collection of graphs, we can see the Hadza curve extends all the way to 80 years old. However, we also see that the Agda curve ends at 70. So indeed, some of the tribes do survive a bit longer on average, but still they don't reach anywhere near the peak size and age of the United States curve. Well, these results are pretty interesting and convincing. It seems that a few different ways to look at it, whether it be historic or comparing to modern tribes, we still see that modern populations in modern civilization, the UK, the US, Mozambique, whatever their healthcare and nutrition level is actually extending human lifespans. So that's pretty positive. Whether or not the quality of life is actually high enough in that extended lifespan, that's hard to tell. But even the Middle Ages have more extended lifespans, and in the Middle Age, most people probably have pretty decent quality of life in modern society. One interesting factor to consider here is evolution. So far, we've only talked about the potential effects of modern civilization or modern technology or modern lifestyle and how it compares to natural lifestyles. But how did evolution change lifespan? Looking at chimpanzees, technically our living ancestors, they don't live anywhere near as long as humans do. They don't live as long as paleolithic humans did, they don't live as long as hunter-gatherers did, and they definitely don't live as long as modern humans live right now. They typically die around 40 or 45 years old and almost never survive past 65 years old. Why would that be? Well, given that they actually live their natural lives and we lived our natural lives in the Paleolithic, it's probably something genetic related. There's some theories out there, and I haven't researched enough to really nail it down. Some discuss immunity and genes related to immunity, but then those also relate to other modern diseases, and it might relate to how we can digest, our adaptability, our microbiome adaptability. I actually don't know the true why, but simply put, it seems to be mainly a genetic difference that actually jumps our lifespan from 45 to 50-ish to around 70 or 75 to actually be a natural age to die. So let's break this down a little bit further to ask, what is everyone actually dying of in all of these populations? So if everyone was literally just dying of old age, we would have this perfect spike right at whatever the natural age of death is. But actually, we do see this elevated curve throughout all of the ages in these older or less modern populations. So what's doing everyone in? Well, as you may expect, based on what we call diseases of civilization, most of these populations did not die, or most people in these populations did not die of the diseases of civilization. That means that people are not dying of cardiovascular disease. Check. People are not dying of cancer, vast majority of the time. Check. People are not dying of diabetes or the related health concerns of diabetes. So that all checks out. It's very hard to find these diseases in general. Nonetheless, seeing these diseases actually killing people. One very interesting note that I found about cardiovascular health is that sometimes people do die of cardiovascular issues or of cardiac issues later in life in these tribes, but it's much less often due to an improper diet and actually due to malnutrition at younger ages. So that's sort of an interesting exception to take into account. According to a seminal study by Gervin and Kaplan, the vast majority of deaths in many of these tribes is actually illness, which typically derives from some infectious disease or some kind of problem that leads to farther symptoms that can't be healed in these tribes. So for example, respiratory disease or gastrointestinal disease or fever is among these illnesses that tend to be the most common cause of death within these tribes. This table breaks down causes of death more specifically for the different tribes included in the study and for different ages within that tribe. Again, you'll see high numbers in the illness categories, but you also see some degenerative disease taking people out and, unfortunately, violence and accident. Looking at another study that focused on pre-contact Hiwi, we can see that infectious disease specifically was a tremendous cause of deadly illness. This is true across all age groups, but shockingly, for females, especially in the 1 to 9 year age group or 40 to 79 year age group, we have above 70 and even 88% of people dying from infectious disease. So at this point, we've seen a lot of information about lifespan of prehistoric, historic, and modern hunter-gatherers that live outside of civilization, and seen some comparisons to modern civilization and how actually effective modern civilization has been in extending lifespan. We've also seen some of the reasons that natural living humans might actually die and how common it is for infectious disease to actually take out humans. In fact, there's a point from a study by Black et al. That says that some of the reason you won't see infectious disease in some populations is actually because in a small enough tribe, they would just get completely wiped out. So you won't see a living population with certain diseases. That being said, we see plenty of the effect of infectious disease on mortality in these tribes. Once again, we have the chance to ask ourselves, are we surprised by the data, or is the data exactly what we would have expected? Were you of the camp, for example, that thought that infant mortality is the only thing bringing down the human lifespan of prehistoric or of non-civilized populations? Or did you know for sure modern medicine is killing it, or not killing it, not killing them, and extending lifespans across all ages? What did you think about the immune system of non-civilized people? Did you think that given their perfect or natural diets that they would have such a high occurrence of infectious disease, for example? Let me know which of your expectations was met or completely contradicted in the comments. And of course, if you have any more resources about any of these topics that you think would shed some more light on it, put them in the comments.